This is our inaugural speaker series between the City of Atlanta and Georgia Tech, and it's an example of some of the really interesting research that we're doing at Georgia Tech and its application to citywide operations and many of your roles and responsibilities.
The city can continue to do what it's done historically the same way, but by bringing this research capacity to bear, the city can do things smarter. They can do things better. The average person working in the city is focused on their operational responsibilities and don't necessarily understand the wide opportunities or breadth of services that Georgia Tech could deliver. Helping the employees to understand that with these new emerging solutions and research that's coming out of Georgia Tech, there might be better ways to solve problems that we've struggled with for decades. So making them aware of what's possible is very, very powerful.
So as stated, I'm Kari Watkins. As you can see in the slide behind me, I am in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So I'm a little more hardcore with like the public works folks that are in the room and functions like that. Traditionally, but I do a lot of partnerships with folks like Chris, who is with digital media at Georgia Tech. And so the first project that we're going to talk about was actually a partnership between the two of us, and Chris has taken it to new places that he's going to talk about after I give a little bit of introduction to what we've done so far on the project. The theme of this is smart and connected communities, riding and sensing to improve transportation networks. So in this case, we're specifically talking about cycling for transport, which is something that the city of Atlanta has been big on lately. You've probably seen lots of new bike lanes going in, protected cycle tracks, trails with the Beltline, all kinds of excitement happening in this realm. So for you guys, I'm going to start off with a question. How many of you, be honest, no judging, how many of you would feel comfortable biking on a road like this? Not too many, a few. All right, this is actually Charles Allen, kind of close to Piedmont Park. How many of you would feel comfortable biking on a road like this? Oh, even more than the Shero. Okay, you like a bike lane. I'm seeing that you like a bike lane. How many of you would feel comfortable biking on a road like this? Wow, okay. So a buffered bike lane is okay. Ponce is a pretty busy roadway, but maybe a buffered bike lane gets you to the point where you would. How many people would bike on a road like this? I heard some yeahs in the room. So this is actually, we've got some similar examples coming about in Atlanta, but this one I actually pulled from Chattanooga. Not to bring the enemy into the room or anything like that, but this is one of their major streets downtown, and they've created a protected bike lane that is separated with parking. So these cars that you see on the side are actually parked cars. So there's a little bit of distance. Whenever there's not parked cars, they've got these nice planters there so that the bikes really feel separated from the cars. And exactly that kind of perspective where in the beginning you guys were kind of like, I'm not so sure I would bike on that road. But when we got to the protected one, pretty much everybody in the room said, yeah, I would do that. And the question that I even put to you further is, would you bike on a road like this with your kids? Because that's really a big goal of the research program that I do, is making cycling available for transportation. And that means pretty much all users. So anybody who is physically capable of cycling should have the ability to actually do it for transportation. And in many cases, it's our kids in the age of 10 to 14. They would love the freedom of actually being able to get around on bike, but when we don't design for it, it's really hard for them to do so. So a lot of the research that Chris and I have done over the past 6 years is through a program called Cycle Atlanta. And what we were trying to do with this is at the same time that a lot of infrastructure was being built in the city, we were trying to get an idea of where people bike, how people go out of their way to use this higher level infrastructure, like the cycle tracks and things like that, who the people are who are biking in Atlanta, what kinds of user groups are the ones who would go out of their way to use different infrastructure, where are there gaps in the network where it's really hard for somebody to get from one place to another, so you see them going way out of their way. even taking data from people in terms of where the issues and the assets are. And we did a lot of this through the Cycle Atlanta app. So Cycle Atlanta records your bike trips, and now there's new programs that the city's partnering with that do similar things. The name is escaping me at the moment. There's nobody in the room who would know. There's a new vendor who's doing something very similar to Cycle Atlanta, which puts Chris and I off the hook for having to provide an app like this continuously. But the goal is the same. The goal is to understand where it is that people are biking using some sort of recording device that they're keeping with them. And in this case, we're doing it simply through your smartphone. So a lot of people have Cycle Atlanta just records that trip so that we can pull that data to understand where it is that people are going to and from, what kind of roads they're using, and that type of thing. One of the fundamental parts of this is that there's what we believe to be a spectrum of different rider types that go from strong and fearless to no way, no how. And this categorization has been used in a couple of places, and we modified it for our own purposes. But strong and fearless are the folks like Chris over here next to me, who would bike in pretty much any circumstance. They're going to take the shortest path between their origin and their destination. They're very comfortable, very fit, so they're able to go pretty fast on roads where the cars are going 45 miles an hour. There's not as big of a differential as, say, myself when I'm trying to bike on a similar road, and I don't feel comfortable in those kinds of situations. I am a regular cyclist, though, so I tend to fit in the bracket of enthused and confident. So I bike regularly, but I'm not quite as confident as those people in the red on there. And then we've got a whole host of people who would call themselves comfortable but cautious. So they're willing to bike, but they're pretty cautious about where they do it. So they're only going to do it on quieter residential streets, only in places where there's some pretty nice bike infrastructure. And then you see for the last category, interested but concerned, we actually picture a child. This is the category where folks are really nervous about being able to get from one place to another. Maybe they've got kids with them, or they're just very, very cautious. They're only going to bike on things like the Beltline or very, very protected bike infrastructure. And then, of course, with anything, you've got the no way, no how. There's a group of folks out there who say cycling for transportation, even for recreation, never going to happen. And that's okay. Those aren't the people that we're focused on. But we're focused on understanding how do we get the people in this middle range, not the strong and fearless who are already out there biking, not the folks who say no way, no how, but the folks in the middle range. How do we get them out there cycling once in a while for transportation so that we can improve the transportation system, make it less congested, have healthier folks in our city, have less pollution in our city. I mean, there's lots of benefits from us converting to having a certain portion of trips being by bike. So I think this is, okay. So some of the things that we've done with the data so far, we've done some surveys looking at how people put themselves into these different categories, and we saw things like that separated paths make a difference, maybe not so much to the strong and fearless. This was actually a survey where the midpoint was a 3. So as you see numbers higher than 3, that means people were more likely to say that that helped them choose cycling. So a separate path is something that as you get towards that interested but concerned category, people were looking to do that type of cycling. What made them not want to bike? Heavy traffic, high speeds. You see that across the board that made folks not want to bike, and we have lots of roads with those. And then steep hills deterred folks too. You can see the interested but concerned were more deterred than the strong and fearless by something like a steep hill. But we're moving towards electric bikes and things like that that can help mitigate that as well. So I have another study before I pass it off to Chris that I wanted to talk about for a second, where we're looking at bicycle preferences and increasing trips. And we're looking in 3 different cities: Chattanooga, Tennessee, Anniston, Alabama, Opelika, Alabama. And we've now added, thanks to GDOT, some Atlanta neighborhoods along the Beltline. We're using these locations to test, as new bike infrastructure is actually constructed, how does that change people's trips? So we're doing that using the Cycle Atlanta app so we can track their trips, but also through doing surveys. If some of you live close to the Beltline segments that are opening up, or the neighborhood in between the two, you might have actually gotten one of our surveys. I've had a number of people come up to me and say, hey, I got your survey, to which I always respond, hey, did you fill it out? So we're using these surveys to try to understand what people's preferences are. And we're doing a series of questions that look like this, where they get an image and then a couple of questions about how comfortable, how safe, how willing are you to bike if this was the kind of road that you were confronted with. So something similar to what I showed you at the beginning, only we're using a very standardized background. In this case, we actually picked a point in Little 5 Points that looks like it could be a small town. It looks like it could be sort of just outside of the city. It was about the most generic street that we could find, and then we messed with the cross-section to make it look like it was only 2 lanes with a bike lane and things like that. And so here's a blow-up of the image, so this may look familiar to some of you. But so we showed a series of images like this. But it's great to use surveys to do this kinds of things, but at Georgia Tech, we try to use technology to ask these kinds of questions as much as possible. And that's actually where Chris's research comes in. So I'm gonna pass it off to him for the rest.
My part of the collaboration has been really focusing on developing the technology behind how we collect data and then understand how people are moving through the city. So I was part of the group that built the Cycle Atlanta app initially, and then now we've started to, as Kari said, take it to the next level. And maybe as a brief aside, though, is to really say, as we think about sensors, and your smartphone is one type of sensor. It tracks your location and other things as well. We wanted to think about other kinds of sensors that we could put on the bike. And the way that we did this, actually just concluding this week, was through a program called Data Science for Social Good. And every summer for the past 4 years, I've been involved with this program that brings in interns that are college students everywhere from undergrad all the way up through graduate school to work on data science problems with partners in the Atlanta region. We've had many partnerships and many projects that have been focused with the city of Atlanta, with fire and rescue, with the police department, with ARC and the cycling groups here as well. And so as a kind of aside, we have this ongoing set of programs where, if your department has a data problem and you have a desire to have a small group of students work on that problem for 10 weeks over the summer, please come talk to me throughout the year, because we're always looking for new opportunities and ways to have students work on problems that have immediate and kind of useful impact to different organizations within Atlanta. This summer, what my student group did was work on sensors to understand the level of stress someone feels. So as Kari mentioned, when we talk about wanting to make changes in the cycling infrastructure, we want to support all kinds of cyclists, not just this strong and fearless gentleman here, also referred to as a mammal, which is a middle-aged man in Lycra. And so this kind of person is exactly what Kari mentioned, is going to be riding kind of regardless of traffic conditions or geography, and is really just dedicated to cycling, both for transportation but also for fitness and sport. This is a kind of rider that we're really focused on trying to figure out how to support, right? And to be clear, she's also a very serious cyclist, right? She's got this giant utility bike with 3 children and gear strapped on the back. So it's not like this is a casual cyclist. This is someone who is still dedicated, but she's going to be making very different choices about what routes to take as she moves through the city, because she's now probably riding with 70 pounds of stuff instead of 20. And as we talk about this and we think about what goes into these choices, part of it is, of course, the kind of cyclist or how confident the person feels riding through the city. But the other part of it are the kinds of things that are going on in the environment that cause that cyclist stress, Right, so Kari talked about some of these being the speed of traffic and the proximity of traffic. So if you have 2 lanes of high-speed traffic passing you, that's a stressful thing. If you're going up and down hills, that's a stressful thing. If the quality of the road, if you're having to dodge steel plates or potholes or things that are maybe forcing you into traffic and away from the edge, that's stressful. Quality of the air, right? If you're stuck in traffic and it's uncomfortable to breathe, right? And so these are all the kinds of things that are happening in the environment that we want to try to understand and try to be able to sense. And so from the app that we've deployed over the, since 2012, we know where cyclists go, and we have a sense of kind of what different kinds of cyclists, how they choose to navigate the city. But what we don't know as much about is what are the environmental conditions? What are those environmental stressors that are happening on the roads that people are using to traverse the city? And so what we've done over the summer is build a mobile sensing platform that goes onto a bicycle and has a constellation of sensors. So what you're seeing here is the box that goes onto the back of the bike being assembled by a student very quickly and efficiently. And within this box, you can see there's in the top left corner, kind of on the lid, there's a set of gas sensors, so sensing air quality. We have sensors in there that are trying to detect proximity of objects, so both passing cars, as say on your left side, as cars are moving on the road, as well as parked cars, because there's another one of those stressful moments is riding along a line of parked cars, wondering, waiting for that door to open in front of you and take you down. And so trying to understand, how close are things as they happen. There's also some proximity detectors that are looking backwards on the bike, so we can start to understand how close is traffic closing in on you. Again, trying to figure out what is it like, as these different kinds of riders are moving through the city on different kinds of roads at different times of the day, what goes into that experience, and how do we start to understand in some sense, the thresholds of where these stresses happen, right? So it could be that cars going by you at 25 miles an hour, it's not so stressful, it's fine. But maybe up to 30 miles an hour, that becomes an inflection point where suddenly people are making very different choices. And this is the kind of thing that we really want to try to understand with these data. All right, so here's the full kit. So the big square thing, that goes on the back of the bike. The lit up piece is a part that's mounted on the front, and they talk to each other over the course of the ride. And you can kind of see them in the background here. But really, we have 3 constellations of sensors that are trying to determine everything that's going on as someone rides through the city. So we want to understand the road conditions. So we have GPS, we have 3D accelerometers, gyroscopes, and magnetometers. All of these things help us understand kind of the position and the way the bike is moving through the environment. So in some sense, we can tell when you're swerving around something, if there's an obstacle that you're trying to get around, or we can tell how rough the road surface is, so if it's not a good road surface. We can also, with the magnetometer, we're hoping to also be able to detect large vehicles. So if you're in traffic with lots of, just passenger cars, that's one thing. But if you're in traffic and like lots of UPS trucks are passing you, that's a totally different thing. So can we start to disambiguate that? There's a microphone array, which again, we're also going to be using to understand road surface quality and traffic conditions. We have a whole suite of sensors that are focused on environmental conditions. So temperature, humidity, barometer, ultraviolet, and then the gas is the most common pollutants that come off of traffic. So ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter. And all of these help us get a better understanding of what's going on when you're at street level. And I think one of the novelties of this is not just understanding what it's like for cyclists to be moving through the city, but also for pedestrians who are on the, because we're sensing these air conditions at street level, at kind of pedestrian level, at human level, we understand, okay, at peak traffic hours when you're downtown, what is it like versus in midtown versus in the neighborhoods? And then how does that help us plan not just for cycling transportation, but also for the pedestrian transitions between, say MARTA to neighborhood to work? And then on the back of the bike is really the traffic sensing sensors, traffic condition sensors. So we have 2 laser rangefinders and 3 ultrasonic rangefinders. And again, all of these are to try to get that sense of what's going on around you, particularly looking back. We assume that the cyclist knows what's coming, but it's that moment of stress is really when surprises arrive from the rear at high speed. I joke with my wife, who doesn't like it when I ride with my headphones on, for two reasons. Because one, I think I'm going fast enough that the wind noise doesn't matter, but also the one that gets me, I'm not going to hear coming anyway. And so what we want to do is have sensors so that we can actually try to understand what's coming from behind. And so when we go out and we ride and we collect these data, we are able to start to really get an image of the changing conditions. And so this animation starts to show a ride that started at Tech Square, where our offices are, and proceeds down into downtown. And so along the horizontal, like the white lines, that's proximity. So that's detecting buildings and cars and things that are close to the bike, not to scale at all. But in the vertical column, that's particulate matter. So that's one of the gas sensors that's telling us about the pollution conditions. And you can see very clearly as you come downtown, on, I think it was Spring Street, there was a traffic jam. And so you can actually see very immediately that, oh, the air conditions changed. And so these are ways that we can start to understand, what is it, how do you think about traffic flow for cyclists? How do you move them through or think about diverting different kinds of facilities to avoid these places where you're really exposing people to kind of that naked exhaust as you're stuck sitting next to cars idling. And so this is really only 4 or 5 sensors that we're looking at here, right? And we have close to 20 on the bike. So you can imagine that as we begin to collect more data and as we begin to build up more robust models for how this is going to inform our understanding of what it's like to go through the city. So now we have 3 working sets complete with the materials to build, I think, another 5. And the idea now is as we get these sets built is to start to deploy them to interested people who are willing to go out and ride for a week or 2 on their daily routine, right, and on the commute or on the weekend, whenever it happens to be, so that we have a stronger sense of what's going on, and then we can start to train different computing models on those data, so that we know the data is kind of in some sense meaningless if we just say, oh, there's something that was 3 feet away from you. We also need to go back and say, okay, well, this is what a car looks like when we have the data. This is what a car moving past you looks like. This is what a truck looks like. And as we do that, then we can start to train up some machine learning algorithms to say, okay, now we can start to do larger sets of prediction and understanding across the city without having to kind of go through manually tagging different events. It's not actually done, but I've lost the mouse. There it goes. Right, so that's been my contribution to this and where I work with Kari, and I'll pass it back to Kari to talk more about mobility as a service.
In addition to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about an area that I don't yet have any research in. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But Janae and I have actually been talking about this for a little while, so I thought it was good to bring it to an audience at this city so that we could get your thoughts and kind of give you a little bit of background about some of the things that we've been thinking about. So it's titled Mobility as a Service. And where this begins is this idea of all these new transportation services that are popping up everywhere. So how many of you have used a Lyft or an Uber before? So we're getting to the point where most of the room raises their hand. There's all kinds of similar what we call ride-hailing services, or TNCs, to Uber and Lyft that are popping up out there across the world. Ride sharing, these are slightly dated. Some of these companies no longer exist, but all of these concepts still do. Karma, Hovey, there's other companies where they're trying to link people up to share a ride. Even in Lyft or Uber, sometimes they're doing that. Smart transit services, as they call it. So Bridge, Leap, if you've heard of any of these, they've done pilot studies in a number of different cities. Car sharing, how many of you are familiar with Zipcar? Okay, or Car2Go in some other cities is what they use. Bike sharing, which we now have our own bike sharing program here in Atlanta. How many of you have used a bike share bike before? Couple. You have a station right out front of City Hall if you want to give it a try. And then information aggregators, as I call them, Ride Scout, Transit Screen. So there's a lot of movement in the transportation sector in a way that some people like to say we've never seen before, all these exciting new concepts, it's just crazy. The thing is, most of these things have actually existed for decades and decades. Lyft and Uber, it's really just a taxi. We've had carpools for a very long time. We've had shuttle services for a very long time. You've been able to rent a car for about as long as cars have existed. Bike rentals, the same. And even call centers are something that you've always been able to get information, maybe in different formats. The thing that makes these services unique from what we had seen before is really all about technology. That's the piece that's changing. All of these traditional services are becoming much, much easier because of the smartphone in your pocket, because you have easy access to information, to pass that information back and forth between you and whoever the service provider is. So you now know exactly where that vehicle is, and that's Uber and Lyft are easier to use than a taxi because you can see where that vehicle is. You can read the rating of who your driver is. Your credit card information is already in the app. So it makes that whole exchange easier. But the concept of the underlying transportation use of that is really no different from what we've had for a very, very long time. So what's changing is this increased mobile usage. And this graph is a little bit dated already. It's April of 2015 is the latest that I have on here. But you can see that up to 70% of people now have a smartphone. And this doesn't actually change dramatically across demographic lines, income lines, et cetera, male to female. The only way that this is not close to that same average 70% rate is with age. That's where we really see a difference. So in some cases, the older parts of our population are getting left behind a little bit in this new transportation world. But for the most part, a lot of us have smartphones in our pockets and can get access to these services and provide their data just as easily as anyone else. So why is it that I care about the concept of shared transportation? So you heard Chris and I talk about cycling, which is pictured on your right. A lot of the work that I do, and then I'm going to talk about it in a minute, is working with transit agencies to make their services more efficient. And this image I love. It's been used in a lot of different cases. It's basically to explain the concept of how space is something that is at a premium in American cities, in all cities. And so if we try to do the image on the left, where everybody's always riding by themselves, we're never going to have enough space in order to accommodate everyone. So the more that we can do to make it easy to be busing and biking, the better it's going to be. But now we're entering this new space with all these new technologies. So now we have Lyft and Uber and autonomous vehicles, and those things are going to save us from this situation, right? They're going to make the car image better. Well, I hate to tell you, but here's what the picture looks like with autonomous vehicles, and here's what the picture looks like with Uber and Lyft. It's not changing that space equation at all. And so the same problems that we have endemic to the transportation network are still going to exist into the future unless we do things a little bit differently with these services. And that's why shared transportation, so ways that we can get multiple people into a vehicle and such, are still critically important. And that's kind of where this concept of mobility as a service begins. The idea that the sharing economy is about economic goods and systems that enable shared access to things. So it's one thing for us to be able to share a car or to share a bike, but in addition, what we're really trying to do is use excess capacity. So as the quote from Wikipedia, a shared information source, says, these systems take a variety of forms, but all leverage information technology to empower individuals, corporations, nonprofits, and government with information to enable the reuse of excess capacity. So if ever there was a place with excess capacity, it's our transportation system, right? You're like, wait a minute. I was just stuck in traffic when I went home last night. When I came in this morning, there's no excess capacity, but there actually is, because in most of our vehicles, there's 3 empty seats. And so that's a lot of excess capacity in the transportation system. And that's really what shared transportation is trying to do. So the concept of mobility as a service builds on this in that they're looking to make the backbone of the transportation system be public transportation. How do we make it so that transit is great, and in situations where transit doesn't work for you, we're going to fill in these other options to make it work better. Oops, that's my phone, sorry. So I'm going to, whoop, oh no, Chris. It's there? Wait, I'm trying to go back though. Is that it? Yeah. Okay, here we go. Okay. Did I just pause it? There we go. Okay, so there's actually sound on this, so I'm going to try to talk over the best that I can and say it instead of them. So the idea here is, what type of mobility do you actually need? A car, a plane, a bike? And how much does it all cost? So the idea of mobility of a service is that you may have currently to pay separate bills for a taxi in your car and gassing up your car. It's each a separate price tag. It's often a separate app to access these things. But what if it could all be brought together into one mobility package? So you use a taxi for a certain amount, you have a rental car for a certain amount, commuter transport for a certain amount, unlimited access to the public transportation system. Hey, there we go. Someone's messing with sound. Or how about a package where this gentleman needs taxi abroad, video conferencing, rental bikes, pickup services, lease cars, and he pays a certain price for that package. And I think there's a third example, or some similar package. So you can imagine that different people, here's a family, they would want maybe taxi sharing, lease cars, unlimited use of public transportation, and they pay a different package for their whole family. So the idea is thinking about transportation as almost a utility instead of the way that we traditionally do. So of course it's a promo video. They say, what will this do? Give you more time, less pollution, more room in your life, high quality commuting, less trouble, more freedom. So as I said, the idea here is think of your cell phone package, or think of how you get water, or any other sort of typical utility. And the notion is if we move transportation towards that type of utility, where you are using the public transportation system as the base of the transportation network, but as you need a service because it's not working out for you, you can combine in that bike share trip, you can combine in that Uber or Lyft trip, you can, even the taxi system and other things similar to that. And the idea is packaging this all up so you get a certain amount of time on each of these different modes, or a certain amount of flex time in one monthly package, and that you would then pay that. This concept has been hot in Finland, and I have another video that I'm actually going to skip, but if you're interested, I can show that to you later. But essentially what my research is about is overcoming the barriers to transit and cycling so that these kinds of concepts can work better. And as you saw with the project that Chris and I were working on, a lot of this is done through crowdsourced data, but also through open data channels, and a lot of this is via usable apps for people. I got started in this vein through a project called One Bus Away that gives you arrival times for when buses and trains are coming. We have an API for developers. It's a free app. And the reason that I do this is actually that we're trying to evaluate the impacts for riders. So we want to know things like, we have multiple different app interfaces, so Android, iPhone, Windows Phone, and Amazon. And it's deployed in a bunch of different cities across the US, including at one point Atlanta, but no longer Atlanta, unfortunately. The reason that I do this is I'm really curious about things like, how does this change people's satisfaction with the transit system? And it turns out that 90% of the people who use these kinds of technology are more satisfied, even if the transit system doesn't improve at all. We also look at things like ridership. So I did a study in New York City to see, as they phased in this kind of real-time information about the transit system, how did that actually change ridership in New York? And so they actually launched in Brooklyn, then Staten Island, then Bronx, then Manhattan. And it gave us the ability to look at how ridership was changing in each of these boroughs as they increased it. So as they implemented the service. So it's called a panel regression method. And what we were able to discover is that there was about a 2% increase in ridership just due to giving people real-time information in New York. And in a time when transit's having trouble competing, that's a great ridership increase. So that is the idea of the mobility as a service concept. We're hoping to possibly bring this to Atlanta through strategic partnerships and working with some of these folks. If you have ideas about that, please let Janae or I know. And I'm going to open it up to questions for both Chris and I.
As far as you're collecting data via your sensors, how are you tracking rate increase or assuming your stress?
Yeah, so right now we're not specifically tracking stress, we're tracking the environment around. So what we want to do now is first get basically a robust training data set, and then go back, once we know something about the city and say we know what a car looks like in the data, and we know what different pollution levels look like and things like that, then go back and do a more targeted study where we would actually have people ride and indicate that, how stressed do they feel. So we would poll them kind of as they go, tell us, thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, I think the challenge with trying to do it biometrically is that you're exercising, and so the exercise by itself is a stressor. And so teasing out the details of like that moment when a car goes by and you kind of freak out is really hard when you're already kind of huffing and puffing and sweaty. So especially in Atlanta, right? We're constantly, there's no looking suave after a bike ride in Atlanta summer.
The mobility of the service is really interesting. Are there any conversations going on now?
Yeah, so the concept was initially done predominantly in Sweden and Finland, where they have really robust underlying public transportation systems. The folks who had implemented it there, it was very successful. People loved it, loved the idea of buying this package. They want to look at some American models, so I've had some conversations with them, but they're aiming for some of the larger cities with, again, a more robust transportation network. So they're looking at New York, Chicago, some places like that at first. But they were pretty open to the idea of trying to do it in Atlanta. The part that we had been questioning in our thoughts about it so far was, who should do this? The way that it was done in both of those places, it was an outside information aggregator. So they came in with their own app, and they were sort of purchasing on behalf of these folks the services from all these different companies. And so there's sort of this middleman with an extra level of profit to be gained from putting these packages together. So even though they were offering a discount to folks, it wasn't that big of a discount. So the question is, how could it be run? Could it actually be run by the city or, some sort of vendor where the profit that they're making off of it is some sort of assumed profit instead? And that's not my world. So that's the kind of thing I'm not so great at. The reason that I'm interested in this is I want to evaluate the transportation impacts. And so Janae and I had actually put a proposal in that we didn't get further with, but we're looking to possibly do that again if we can find the right funding to do a test version just to see, does Atlanta have a good enough transit network to be the base for this? And could we actually attract people who are regular car drivers who would love to be taking transit, but they have so many times when it doesn't fit their life that they don't make that decision? And would something like this be what would push them over the edge so that they would actually be able to give up a car? So.
What transportation systems were combined for this?
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, so it's a different picture in Europe. They're looking at, could they actually combine this with like the intercity train networks and with air, and so the broader concept could include all kinds of things, right? That your package even includes a certain number of miles with Delta per month or something like that, so you could do your weekend getaway, right? And almost like buying into the family, like Delta, you can be standby if you're a family member, would they sell those kinds of low usage flights to other people through packages like this? But I think at the base level, you're talking about MARTA would have to be involved, because the whole goal is to try to make it easier to use these shared transportation services like public transportation. And then you would bring in the Uber, the Lyft, the taxi companies to sort of fill in some of the gaps, so you get a certain number of miles or minutes in those services. Certainly bike share would be a piece of that. So put your bike share membership with a certain number of minutes into the package as well. And then I think you would just have to go from there, what other services make logical sense, at least at a base rate. So, yeah.
So, I lived in Europe for a number of years. So looking at your transit system, doesn't compare to what we have in Atlanta. Their density, population density, and also land use density is way far advanced, and vehicle ownership is very expensive, including high gas prices, and parking is very expensive. So I think there is the situations, I say, force them maybe to get into that kind of system. But in Atlanta, when you have a rail system, north, south, east, west, that's it. How would that support this kind of system?
Well,
for implementation in Atlanta?
And that's the real question. I mean, the rail system that we have is pretty minimal, but there's pretty decent connections to that with the bus network, with the bike share program, with things like Uber and Lyft. So at what point do you have enough of a base network that it would actually work? Some of the cities, Finland, Helsinki is fairly dense in the inner core of it, but the program went out pretty far outside of that urban core. And it's not quite like some of the European cities that you might think of, like London or Paris or places like that. So you do have to have a pretty good transit system at its base, but we're looking at, hopefully being there with the transit tax in, another 20 years or so, that we may have that kind of underlying network. And I personally think that even with a mediocre network, a package like this, there's a lot of people that it actually would work for. It would have to be strategic people, right? It's not going to be the whole city. But I myself, live in a family of 4, and we only have one car. For a number of years, Chris was the same. I think he still is. So for us, we may not give up both of our cars, but giving up one of our cars because we have this kind of package for our mobility needs would work for us quite well. Are there other questions?
Has there been any visual analysis using traffic cameras to monitor bicyclists, or considering putting cameras in some of the monitoring devices to kind of really see and feel the experience of a rider in all the situations you guys are kind of tracking?
Not that I'm aware of, but so along the work that's going into the North Ave corridor, the smart corridor there, part of that is looking at, can you start to pick out pedestrian and bike traffic as well as car traffic, and at key intersections to understand how those traffic patterns are emerging and what's happening over the course of a day. Did you have a question?
Yes, my question is in the data collection. At some point in time, will that lead to a rating of the routes, which route is safer for bike, which route is more hazardous and not?
Yeah, so one of the things that we get with the route data is we get the way that people are currently navigating the city, so we can see, okay, they're making particular choices along the way to get from home to work. That's not necessarily, say, the preferred route, right? So there's a lot of choices that might be going into that we aren't privy to. So maybe they're going by their favorite coffee store, but otherwise they would go a different way, or maybe there's a road closure or some other kind of construction that they're avoiding. And so one of the things, in some sense, the data that we get off the Cycle Atlanta app is in many ways more interesting to track new facilities as they come online, because then we can see how those new facilities are changing traffic patterns and the way that they're connecting different parts of the city. So the best example we have is we launched the app just before the East Side Beltline opened, right, in 2012. And we can immediately see after that opened, not only that was it, demonstrating massive latent demand for that kind of facility in Atlanta, but also that it was drawing from all over the city, people coming to it, using it, going into Piedmont Park, into Midtown, and then coming back and going back home. Same with the 10th Avenue, or the 10th Street cycle track, that it immediately became of use. And so it's less about, say, predicting where people might go or what might be the best routes, but very good at showing how different facilities attract different segments of the cycling population and kind of light up different neighborhoods and connect them in ways that weren't previously there.
But the monitoring the bike, the sensors, that really is all about what you're talking about. So the whole idea there is that we would be able to classify these road segments based on the environment on that segment, and we could use data from people saying how stressed they feel to calibrate that, but then you could ride the bike in other places and classify roads based just on this data alone at different times of the day and whatnot. So, and that could be used to feed into trip planners and things like that, where, I don't know if any of you have ever biked somewhere where you've actually tried to plan your trip, like in Google Maps, a bike trip. It's hard. So it's getting easier because we've got so much great infrastructure in Atlanta now that you can just turn on the layer that shows you where all the cycle tracks are, and you can actually link them up to get someplace. But the point of it is that maybe as you go into that trip planner, that you could say, I'm a timid cyclist. And so it would then give you many more cycle tracks and paths and actually make you go out of your way to be on those, as opposed to someone who might be like, well, just give me the quickest path, essentially pretend I'm a car, even though I'm telling you I want the bike route. So. Oh, currently? There's my public service announcement. If you go into Google and you're looking to plan a bike trip, on the left side you can actually click and you can turn on a layer that shows you the bike infrastructure. And it's not always completely accurate, but they do a pretty decent job. This morning there's a segment of the Beltline that they showed open already that I could take, and I got there and found that it was not open yet. So, but that was easy because I've always done the trip before, so I know which way to go if it's not open yet. But they're pretty good about actually putting that in there. And then you can plan a trip the same way you would plan a car trip. You just click bike as your mode and it'll give you a route. So if you want to ask me afterwards, I can show you. Any other questions?
Just a comment. When you showed us a number of street types, bicycle facility types, the first one you showed was Charles Allen, but it's not always whether you have a bike lane or not, the speed of cars, like Charles Allen is very good. Example, it could be shared and it could feel safe. So it's not whether you have a bicycle lane or not, but it's how the speed of cars and the volume of cars, those are factors as well.
And that's exactly it. Charles Allen is good sometimes of the day when there's a big festival at Piedmont Park or when the high school is getting in or out for the day. Then Charles Allen is not such a great road to bike down. And so that's why the sensor project, so we can get an idea of those variations in traffic and how much stress that causes people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.